What's going on, everybody? Instant reaction time. Josh Callaway, Tom Green, Collin Kennedy with you on Sunday evening. Much speculated. It happened. Seth Littrell is done. Oklahoma relieving Seth Littrell of his duties on Sunday evening. Source confirmed that to Sooners Illustrated. Seth Littrell, just 7 games as Oklahoma's offensive coordinator, 8 if you want to include the Alamo Bowl. Felt like it had to happen. Sooners, another disastrous performance on Saturday against South Carolina, scored just 9 points, benched Michael Hawkins, go back to Jackson Arnold, the turnovers. Everyone knows what happened on Saturday. Guys, obviously, we'll pull it apart and react to the different angles of this, but just initially felt like this had to happen, right? I mean, Oklahoma, it kind of was a no-choice spot. The offense has been a disaster. We've all talked about that at length. The Sooners, if they want to find a way to salvage this season, just simply couldn't keep the status quo. And here you go. Seth Littrell, just 7 games into his first year, he's done. And Joe John Finley will take over as play caller.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it felt inevitable yesterday in the postgame. The offense has just been a complete mess. Not just the worst in the SEC this season, but one of the worst in the FBS. Seth Littrell yesterday just almost sounded like a man defeated. I know he said he's a fighter. He was going to keep fighting, but those sound like the last words of a guy on his last legs fighting for his job there. Brent Venables is in a tough position. He said earlier this week that he's not inclined to make midseason coaching changes, but he really had no choice. You go back to when he promoted Seth to offense coordinator, he said, yes, it was kind of the easy and convenient choice, but he thought it was going to be the best choice for Oklahoma. Well, now he had to make the hard choice. That was also the obvious choice at this point. So it's unfortunate that I had to come to that. I think Seth's a good dude. It was just in a tough spot. Obviously, he wasn't having success. I know he wanted to have success at Oklahoma. It's his alma mater. He's won a championship there. Like, he knows what success tastes like at Oklahoma. Right. He just wasn't able to create any as offense coordinator.
I would be curious to know if you guys would agree with this sentiment, but Brent Venables talks about no midseason changes really on his radar, never really been a part of that, but then you see them move Joe John Finley up to the booth for this game specifically, have him right next to Seth Littrell. And to me, that was a little bit of foreshadowing. It was like, okay, we won't make the mass change, but we have to at least set the table for us to know exactly what next steps have to take if we're going to do this. And I think once you saw Joe John Finley go to the booth, sit right next to Seth Littrell, if they weren't going to perform well, it was probably the end. And so I want to echo Tom's sentiment. I hate this for Seth Littrell. I think Seth's a really good guy. He's obviously someone who takes a lot of pride in this program. He really wanted to come back here. It was always something he wanted to do in his career. He wanted to come to Oklahoma, find success, help this program go win another national championship. Didn't play out that way. And unfortunately, you kind of saw some anticipation here. I hope Seth Littrell all the best, but Oklahoma, like Tom mentioned, this was something you really had to do, especially after one of the most embarrassing losses we've seen in a really long time.
Yeah, look, hand up. I loved the hire when they made it. I thought it was the right move. I mean, to keep the continuity, to keep the staff together, Jackson Arnold, that relationship, all that. All the things that Collin said. I mean, it's not like Seth hasn't been a good coach. I mean, his offense in North Texas were prolific. I thought he called a pretty darn good game in the Alamo Bowl last year in kind of his trial run. But the reality, it just hasn't been working for whatever the reason may be. They're 107th in scoring, 128th in total offense, 128th. I mean, just a stunning number there. They can't move the ball. They bench Jackson Arnold to go to Michael Hawkins. They bench Hawkins, go back to Arnold. I mean, it's just been a mess. And this defense is doing everything they can to keep them in games and give them a chance to win. And just it kind of felt like, whether it's all Seth's fault or not, and it's not, because there's a lot of other factors here, you had to do something. You had to do something. And the something is making the move here. So obviously, most fans probably would have thought or maybe speculated or guessed it would be a twofer here, that Joe John Finley would also have his seat warm. He's still there. So they've decided to keep Joe John. Like Collin said, they put him in the booth on Saturday in South Carolina. He's now taking over as the primary play caller. He's going to be the guy for the last 5 games of this season. And I imagine they'll reevaluate things at that point. How do you guys feel like? Do you like that move, kind of keeping the continuity? Because, I mean, the other obvious option would have been, if you want to change both, maybe to go Kevin Johns, who's on the staff. Obviously, he's been an offensive coordinator before. They had some other options in theory. Joe John takes over. What are some thoughts there as far as maybe that's going to, offer some chance to kind of keep things from being totally brand new, but also to change stuff, kind of that middle ground. We'll see how it goes, I guess.
Yeah, so I want to start by saying that Joe John Finley and Seth Littrell, while co-offensive coordinators, somewhat different principles, right? As you guys know, not all offensive minds are of similar wavelength. And a lot of promoting Joe John Finley back when we were talking about this, a previous offensive coordinator search ago, elevating him was to keep him part of the staff and make sure that continuity was still struck. Hiring Seth Littrell, a big part of that at the time was not only a guy that had coordinated offenses, was also a head coach. He was just going to be able to help Brent Venables kind of just deflect that side of the ball and hand the keys over and let things seemingly go smoothly. In Joe John Finley, the advantage here, guys, is this guy knows, in theory, what they were originally hoping to do with Jeff Lebby in the building. Run the veer and shoot system, have Jackson Arnold play within that principle. That's what they recruited him to do. That's what Jeff Lebby fully intended for Jackson Arnold to play through. And then obviously he goes and gets the Mississippi State head coaching job. And we reported on it. There was a time there where we felt like maybe Joe John was going to go with Lebby to Mississippi State because of that working relationship. And not a lot of people know this. The veer and shoot system is a little bit shrouded. It's hid to a degree. It's not the easiest thing to carry over from one place to another. And so what I think the advantage here for Oklahoma is you're on paper promoting someone that would at least let your quarterback get a little bit more comfortability. You would go back to a system that worked previously. And in general, it's a guy that knows the personnel, has been in the building a very long time, but also can kind of take you back to what maybe worked a time or two before.
Yeah.
And if Joe John Finley can call these plays properly, then you may be able to get a little bit more out of the system because you also recruited to it as well, in theory. So I think it's a sensible move. Kevin John's going to be promoted to quarterbacks coach for the time being as well. I'm sure he's going to have a lot of say in the offensive game plan and things of that nature. And guys, we've seen him working closely with Jackson Arnold or Michael Hawkins on the sideline on multiple occasions. And so I think Kevin Johns definitely could have been a candidate, but just knowing the background here for this program, Joe John Finley makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and like the only kind of hesitation that you might have with Joe John is that he doesn't have the play calling experience that like a Seth Littrell had or a Kevin Johns had. So that's why I would expect Kevin Johns to be pretty involved in the game plan, like Colin said. Obviously it was the offense coordinator at Duke. He'd worked with Seth at multiple stops before, I believe, including Indiana. I asked Jackson Arnold, I think it was either at SEC Media Days or it was early in fall camp, just about his relationship with Kevin Johns. And, he talked about just how useful it is to have another, quarterback-centric coach there, because remember, Seth was the quarterback's coach, but he didn't have the, the pedigree of, being a quarterback's coach, specifically at previous stops in his career. He'd been a tight ends coach, he'd been a H-backs coach, stuff like that. Obviously, he'd been an offense coordinator, so he worked closely with quarterbacks, but Kevin Johns is a guy who spent most of his career working with quarterbacks. So him stepping into that role, I think, probably eases things a little bit for Jackson Arnold, especially when you're taking away the offensive coordinator and Seth Littrell. So I'm curious to see how this works the next 5 games. The bottom line is it probably can't get much worse, so you hope that it can get better.
Yeah, I mean, that's completely fair, right? I mean, you heard the numbers I read off earlier. Only 5 teams are worse in total offense in the entire country than Oklahoma, right? Obviously, a place known for Heisman quarterbacks, star wideouts, offensive line in the NFL, all that. It's quite appalling how much has changed in such a short amount of time. Guys, obviously, it's hard to know the full ripple effects here. I mean, who knows if there will be more changes down the road. I mean, you would figure this is a 5-game opportunity for Joe John Finley to kind of audition, right, as maybe being the guy moving forward. But, we talk about it all the time. You hire an offensive coordinator, he might want to bring his own staff. So these next 5 games are probably huge for all the coaches on the staff to kind of audition, frankly, to kind of want to keep the status quo at their individual spot. So it's going to be interesting to see how this all shakes out the next 5 weeks. Like Tom said, it can't really get much worse. I mean, the offense has not been able to do hardly much of anything the last several weeks. So seeing how it all shakes out from here, it's hard to know all the little intricacies and all the little, like I said, ripple effects that are going to happen. But we'll see what happens coming up this week, guys. It's anything else to add? It's a move that, again, felt like it had to happen for Oklahoma as they make the big switch here at offensive coordinator after just 7 games into his first year.
Yeah, I'm curious to see how things unfold these next 5 games. But I think it feels pretty clear that Brent Venables needs to go outside the building to bring in a big name, adequate offensive coordinator, help turn this around. Like I alluded to earlier, he said when he promoted Seth and Joe John that it was the convenient and easy choice. He needs to broaden his horizons, look outside the building a little bit more, kind of assess things and see what is going to be the best thing to turn this offense around next season.
Yeah, I do think that Joe John Finley, like you mentioned, Josh, is going to have an opportunity here to at least maybe earn the gig. Now, it would take a lot. As we know, it's going to be difficult to turn this current offense around. You do have to think, though, maybe you get someone like a Deion Burks back, a Jaleel Farouk back later in the year. If you can coordinate this offense effectively, I think we all know that Brent really would like to keep this staff around, especially considering this current recruiting class and not just how talented it is, but its structure. There's some really talented offensive players in this cycle that are committed to OU. You want to keep those guys in-house, at least for the time being. And so I do think that Joe John Finley will have a chance. Maybe Kevin Johns, through his game planning help, is kind of an inadvertent audition as well. But I also agree with Tom here wholeheartedly. The comfortable choice was there last go around, and I think we all would agree it was at the time seemingly the right choice. But I think in the same sense, we're all in agreement the right choice today is to go outside and at least evaluate external options. I think it's going to be interesting how Brent wants to go about this, because one of two things. Not only is it going to be the offensive coordinator hire that he makes that changes that entire side of the ball, personnel, system, coaches, whatever the case may be, and we know he wants to have a head coach of the offense. This is going to be the offensive coordinator hire or the offensive coordinator decision that inevitably determines his job status as well. And so the next 5 weeks are massive, but this is only the beginning, because truly, for the first time in a long time, I think the future of Oklahoma football is relatively unknown.
Yeah, I think Josh and I were talking about this maybe after the Tennessee game when things went bad, especially with all the talk about Josh Heupel that week. Everybody had rehashed the story that, Bob Stoops in his memoir wrote that the day that he fired Josh Heupel was the worst day of his coaching career because it was the hardest day. Now, Brent Venables, just had to go through the same thing. Seth Littrell was a guy who was a player when Brent was an assistant coach here. He said even though he wasn't, one of his players, he was still one of his favorite guys to be around on those teams. Brent has made that tough choice now. And you look at what Bob Stoops did after he fired Josh Heupel. He went out and got Lincoln Riley, turned things around for Oklahoma offensively over the following almost decade. And now Brent Venables, like you said, his tenure at Oklahoma is going to be defined by what he does next with this hire.
100%. It's uncharted waters.
I also find it too very interesting. The situations are similar yet different, because Bob's job status at the time, as we all know, was far more secure than what I think Brent Venables is currently facing. And so Bob had some ability to hire a luxurious hire and a young up-and-coming offensive coordinator with innovative concepts and things of that nature. I don't know that Brent Venables can just make the fun hire right now, which makes this a little bit more difficult. And so it's similar to what this program once saw, but it's also drastically different. And I do wonder if that shapes how Brent goes about this next hire. Josh, I really wanted to touch on something recruiting-wise as well before we get out of here.
Well, I was going to bring up, because it's uncharted waters, because the fact that, even when we just did this, when Jeff Lebby took the offensive coordinator job, there was, I brought up the recruiting ripple effect, and we talked about some candidates. This is mid-season. It doesn't, Oklahoma hasn't let a coordinator go mid-season since 2018 when they let Mike Stoops go. So this is not something that happens all the time. So I'm glad you brought it up, because I frankly am not really sure how the difference is when it's mid-season, when you're not going to have a replacement until 2 months from now or whatever, how that does affect recruiting. So I'm curious to hear your input on that, because it's a very different situation than the one we just had when Jeff Lebby left.
Yeah. So normally, what I think a lot of, especially old school coaches, prefer to make coaching changes following the season is you have that continuity in place until you truly don't. And I know that's a weird thing to say, but you can always sell continuity to recruits until it's out the window and you can pivot later on in the game. With this change in recruiting, it's really hard to sell prospects on an unknown future. They are making a 4 to 40-year decision. They are facing a time where now more than ever before in this sport, there's going to be other temptations, and the recruiting is going to be plenty from other programs because everyone else is in college football is seeing what's going on here, right? I think this is going to be very difficult for Oklahoma to face over the next few weeks, if I'm quite honest with you, because what do you say? What's your pitch right now? If you just fired the offensive coordinator, all of these position coaches cannot say with 100% certainty that they have a job come next year. I don't know what you do, right? And so,
right.
And it's I think massive because kind of like I touched on earlier, man, this offensive line class is one of the best that Oklahoma will potentially sign on paper in years. The wide receiver group is very impressive. As far as Seth Littrell specifically, because I think people want to know, I think his top guy was Jaden O'Neal. If Jaden O'Neal, things change with him, and I'm not saying that it is, but man, that's like your high 4-star quarterback pledge a couple cycles from now. That was his guy. And the rest of the way, it's very hard for these recruits now to know, as Oklahoma navigates the rest of the season, who they're actually committed to. And so it's going to be difficult, guys. It's something that I can say with certainty right now. I'm already getting some intel headed my way. I think some of these 2025 guys are going to start opening up their minds a little bit. And I understand it because Oklahoma doesn't have a ton to stand on outside of Brent Venables basically saying, bear with us, we're going to figure this thing out.
100%. And, again, like you said, can't blame them because, to re-articulate the point I said earlier, most guys you go hire whatever OC from whatever school, they're probably going to have guys they want to bring with them. So every position coach is kind of fluid. And so for those players, who's going to actually be there when I get there? It's kind of one of those things. I mean, fans wanted this to happen. We all agree that it had to happen, but it's, a lot more intricate than just, plug someone else in and we'll see if it, there are levels to this thing. So we'll see. Crazy times. Oklahoma, again, Brent Venables, after replacing both coordinators after last season, is going to have to find an offensive coordinator again. As Seth Littrell done after just 7 games. We're, of course, going to have tons of reaction. Collin's going to be all over it on the recruiting end of things, of course. We're going to have some, obviously, input on who we think are viable replacement options. So it's a great time to subscribe, Oklahoma247sports.com. Lots of conversation. We still got 5 weeks of season left before we even get to the offseason. So we're going to have a lot of time to talk about this and figure it all out between likely the next full-time hire is made. So a lot to figure out between now and then. But that's it for now. For Collin Kennedy, Tom Green, I'm Josh Callaway. Seth Littrell done after just 7 games in his first year as offensive coordinator. Oklahoma back on the market looking for a new OC in Brent Venables' 3rd season at the helm at OU.